Ladies, we are privileged tonight to have with us 5 members of the League of Women Voters, all of whom have been members for 50 years or more. And Barbara Ballinger wins the award. She has been a member for 59 years. Really longer than I've been alive. Okay, that's not true.
That's it. It sounds good.
It sounds good. So this is going to be rather informal. I've had the privilege of talking to all these ladies earlier. They have incredible stories about what went on in Oak Park and River Forest in the time that they've been members of the League. So we're going to ask each of them to introduce herself, tell us a little bit about her, and then it will be story time. So if you would just tell us your name, maybe a little bit about your profession, your education, anything you wish.
I'm the starter or the beginner or whatever, and since I turned 90, I don't speak with the dulcet tones that I used to. And you all will just have to forgive me if I have to clear my throat a few times. And but I came to Oak Park when I was 3. I'm now 94, so you can do the subtraction for yourself. During that period, it was Depression time. My father was transferred to Dallas, Texas. So at one point in my life, I had just a darling little Southern accent and came back to a 5th grade class and was quite the belle of the ball at that time. That was soon over. I have lived in, I think, 4 different buildings in Oak Park, and I have been in my house just a block from here on Grove Avenue for 65 years. And I am about to move, as I'm sad to say, but happy in other ways, where most of my great-grandchildren and people, my children, live, and it's in Brainerd, Minnesota, a long way away. So I think I'll just treat myself to a luxurious little vacation once in a while and come and take advantage of all your hospitality. Because I love everybody here. I can't tell you how many hugs I get everywhere I go, like Sherlynn does.
And for those of you who may not know, this is Virginia Cassin.
But my life in Oak Park has been just a blessing from the word go. And in the adult part of my life, after I had 8 children and said, you know, I can do that. I can do anything that needs to be done. And I did. So I lived through a whirlwind of a time with a lot of anxiety, a lot of angst, to make sure that Oak Park stayed a diverse community. And that was a huge...
what we're going to talk about with our stories.
All right, so beyond that, my major 30 years has been with the Hemingway Museum, the Hemingway House, just Ernest and me a lot of times. So in between that, you know, many of you have done things with me over the years, so you know. You can talk about me better than I can.
I'm going to tell them a lot about you. Okay.
Okay.
Sherlynn?
Good evening. I'm Cherylin Reed, and I have lived in Oak Park for 50 years, as of August 18th or something like that. And I live in the same house for 50 years. I came here from Detroit, Michigan, and I needed a babysitter almost a week after I got here because my husband was at that time working for the Welfare Council, and somebody was coming in town. I can't even remember who she was, but she was a movie star. And he had to go. And he said, Cherylyn, you have to go too. And I said, but I need a babysitter. I had 3 children, all under the age of 6 or something like that. And I called Virginia Cassin because I had met her, and I had remembered that she said she had 6 or 7 kids or something. And she said, oh, sure, Cherylyn, I got somebody I can send over. My daughter Sharon would be glad to babysit for you. And so she did, and that started me off, because the next thing I heard from Virginia Cassin was, Cherylyn, you need to join the League of Women Voters. And I said, why do I need to do that? And she said, well, number one, you need to meet some people in the village. And you'll do that at the League of Women Voters meeting. So you need to join the League. And I followed Jenna's directions and joined the League of Women Voters. And that's why I'm sitting here tonight, because I joined 50 years ago. I'm the mother of 3 girls. My late husband, Henry Reid, was a social worker at Holmes and at it's now Hawthorne, was Hawthorne then. It's now Julian, Percy Julian. And he passed away in 1994. And I just found that Jenny was so right. Joining the League of Women Voters was the right thing to do. I moved here in 1968. 1971, I became president of the League of Women Voters. From 71 to 73. And that was a wonderful experience. I'll tell you about it later, but that was a wonderful experience. And so I thank you, League, for taking me in and for letting me do all the things you let me do. You bet. And my 5 minutes is up.
I'm Harriet Hausman. I don't know where to start. As far as my education is concerned, I attended 3 major schools, the University of Illinois, and then I went to Northwestern, and then from Northwestern I went to Rosary, and it was at Rosary that I got my Bachelor's of Science degree and met a woman by the name of Sister Maristella, who insisted that I go on and become a clinical psychologist. And I found myself working in labs and testing people for how they thought. And I really felt that I wasn't exactly equipped for it, but she kept pushing me. My goodness, that woman pushed. And I ended up working with her at Rosary and became a teacher there on the psychology of women. And to this day, I don't know anything about the psychology of women, and I was teaching it. But it was a wonderful experience, and actually coming into River Forest, as I have, was sort of an accident. We were living in Maywood, and my son was ready for kindergarten. We registered at Irving School in Maywood, and he was at school about a week when I got a call from the teacher saying, we have to meet. There's something wrong about your son. And I thought, my son? He's such a good little boy. And she said, he is bored. He squeaks his chair all the time. She said, I'm always telling him not to, and it'll be quiet for a while, and then he's squeaking his chair again. She said, you taught him to read. And I said, well, he wanted to read, so we read. And she said, well, this is not the time to read. We teach them that after they go to kindergarten and then first grade. And I thought, this is not the school for my son. So I went looking at schools, and I started out at Oak Park, and then I tried River Forest schools. Willard just appealed to me greatly. So then the job was, how do we find anything within our means for housing to put him in that school? And we ended up buying a piece of property in River Forest. We moved into it. We live in the house. I still live in the house. It's been 65 years now, and I love it. I just love the house. I love the village, and I love the people in it. And after I came here, I thought, gee, I'd like to meet some people, and I went to a forum that was sponsored by the League years and years ago, and it was of the candidates. And it was at that point I thought, this I'm going to join. And it was through the League that I met my sister over there, Millie Earhart. I adopted her because I have no sister. But in any event, it has been a real joy to be a part of the League, to be a part of this village, and meeting all of the most wonderful people through the League.
Barbara?
I'm Barbara Ballinger. Can everyone hear all right? I grew up in Oklahoma and gradually worked my way north to Illinois via Topeka, Kansas, where one of my first jobs was driving a bookmobile. So my first driver's license was a chauffeur's license. The library had bought some old city buses for a song and taken out the seats and put in bookshelves and made bookmobiles out of them. That was before schools had libraries, so we went to the elementary schools at the end of the school day. That was in Topeka. I went to the University of Kansas and came back to Topeka as a fine arts librarian. Subsequently, I graduated with a master's in library science from the University of Illinois at Champaign. My first job was Mays Branch librarian in Oak Park. I thought that would be just about right. I had some library experience, and I still remember walking to work just out of school, my first job, and people would say, "Where are you going?" And I would say, "I'm going to Mays Branch Library." And without fail, people said, "Mrs. Mays was my best friend." That was very intimidating. So I still remember that to this day, and that was a long time ago. I was at the desk one day, and a young Episcopal priest who'd just come to town was there getting a library card. And he said, "Hello, Miss Ballinger, welcome to Oak Park." And I almost leapt over the desk and hugged him and kissed him because he was the first one who'd said that. Well, anyway, from Mays Branch, I moved to the main library as assistant librarian under Les Stoffel. Anyone remember Les Stoffel? A wonderful man. And he was the director of the library. And it was at the time when the old Scoville Institute came down and we were building a new library. And he said, "Barbara, I'm going to build the building and you're going to run the library." So that's sort of the way it worked out. Les went to be the first director of the suburban library system. And I became, those days we called it head librarian. I think today it's called executive director. Go figure. But I was at the library until, hard to believe, 1991. And I didn't ever work in the present building. One of the things I did after retiring was organize the Hemingway Archives, which are housed at the main library in Oak Park. I'm not a professional archivist, but I was the best they had. So there is a full-time professional archivist there now. Another thing, Jenny will remember this, in 1999, we had a Hemingway 100th birthday centennial of Hemingway's birthday in Oak Park, and it was an international scholars conference. So I chaired that, and that was quite interesting. Our sessions were held at Hemingway's high school, Oak Park River Forest High School. So that's about what I'd like to say. It's nice to be here this evening, and thank you.
I'm Bobbi Raymond, and I have shared so many wonderful times with all four of these women. I could actually write a book. It would be a pretty big book about all the things that we did together. I hope as we discuss more this evening that some of those stories will come out. But back to the beginning, my grandparents lived in Oak Park, and my parents lived in Oak Park. And after they got married, they moved to a tiny apartment, a little furnished place on Harrison Street. Well, last Saturday, I was on Harrison Street for What's Blooming, and people are saying, well, what's with it? Why have you gotten so involved on Harrison Street? And I jokingly said, but it's true, well, I was conceived on Harrison Street. I mean, here I am, and I'll be 80 this year, and so like 80 years ago, my parents spent a short time, but a productive time, in that little apartment. Soon after I was born, they moved back to the two-flat that my grandparents owned. And that two-flat was walking distance to Irving School and to the Mays branch of the library, where I established my first wonderful relationship with a librarian, and it was Adele Mays. Now, we were taken, I think, every week to the library, our little school group, and we held hands as we walked down Harrison Street, and the smells still come back to me because the Newlywed Ice Cream Factory was located on Harrison Street. And there they took the chocolate cake, fudge cake, and they rolled it up with vanilla ice cream, and they produced this Newlywed ice cream roll, which was quite delicious, and which you can still find in the freezer section in some stores. But the smell of that factory on Harrison Street was just permeated my being, my senses, and I can immediately call it to my memory because it was such a wonderful smell. We held hands as we walked over to the Mays Library, and Adele Mays had always picked out some wonderful books for her to read to us. My education in Oak Park went on, and it was wonderful wherever it was. I graduated from Whittier School. I had actually spent a couple of years in Chicago, and because I was so advanced in my reading and other areas, when the Chicago public school system tested me, they decided I didn't need to go to third grade. So I skipped it, and I went through a period in the Chicago public school system of learning very little. I had teachers who were kind souls, but not much went on in education there. But there was another side to my life, and that was child actress. And so I would say that is another extremely significant part of my life. I'll just briefly go into a little bit of that, and then I'll finish. But because I could read so well, and because I really wanted to be an actress on the radio, I turned up at an audition at about age 8 for a record album called The Christmas Story, and I got the job. And after that, I worked a lot as a radio actress, and then television and films and all of that. Well, the important part about that was being with really brilliant adults. And the education I had from those adults took the place of what I wasn't getting in the Chicago public school system. But the nice thing was they didn't really care if I showed up or not. So I really spent a lot of my grade school until I got back to Oak Park, not going to school much, but acting a lot and really learning a lot. I learned about Dickens when I acted in Cricket on the Hearth and many other wonderful radio shows in the days when Chicago radio meant a full symphony orchestra playing in the background. So you walked into a studio, and there was this full symphony playing, and I learned to love classical music from that experience. When we moved back to Oak Park, it was sort of, I would say, traumatic, because I was suddenly at Whittier School, fairly uneducated, and had a lot of catching up to do. And I think because of that experience and feeling like I was an outsider, like I really couldn't compete academically, probably, and I'll talk about this later, motivated me a lot to feel a great deal of empathy for kids who don't feel that they can compete in our school system, and who feel that they're not part of the system, that nobody really cares about them, and that other kids are the elite, so to speak. And so I think that was a really wonderful experience. And I guess what I'd like to finish by saying, of course, my high school experience was marvelous. College was wonderful. But I think that in many ways, it's good to have the experience sometimes of being an outsider, because it does give you a lot of understanding and caring about people who are not inside the system. And so I'm very grateful to have had that somewhat painful experience for a short time, but I'm grateful to have had it. I think it gave me a lot of understanding. So I'm going to stop with that.
All of you ladies have had such an impact on the villages as part of the larger issues that were going on in our country: the Fair Housing Act, civil rights, the changing role of women, Vietnam. So we have about a half hour. I'm just going to ask you to share your stories and be respectful that everybody needs a chance to talk. So why don't you start, Bobbi, since you...
Well,
at the end.
okay, so I was living in New York City in a very diverse neighborhood, and I loved the fact that there were people from all over the world living in the neighborhood, and people of color, and people of different economic groups. And so when I moved back to Oak Park in the mid-'60s, and I saw in the newspaper that there was a meeting of the Oak Park and River Forest Citizens Committee for Human Rights taking place at Third Unitarian Church in Austin, and I thought, I was at that point very committed to the civil rights movement that was happening nationally. And so, I mean, there was a national movement that we all wanted to be part of. And so I showed up at that meeting, and that meeting changed my life for the next 50-some years. I met a lot of kindred spirits at Third Unitarian Church, and they had all decided that it was time for a fair housing ordinance to pass in Oak Park. And so for the next couple of years, I worked as housing chairperson of the Citizens Committee. And what that meant was that we were trying to attract black residents to Oak Park, and I accompanied all of the black home seekers to apartments and houses for sale, apartments for rent, and experienced a great deal of pain and discrimination along with the families, some of whom still live in Oak Park today. It was clear proof that discrimination existed. We also, and of course Ginny was part of this as well, but I'll talk more about Ginny later, because Ginny was the person at Village Hall who took the complaints very often on housing discrimination cases, she and John Dwyer. So we met very early on, Ginny and I, but discrimination was very, very rampant. I'll just give you one quick account that I think exemplifies the kind of discrimination that was going on in Oak Park. I accompanied a lovely family looking for a house in Oak Park, and we got to a house that was an open house. You know what open houses are. They're advertised on Sunday in the paper, and anybody who wants to can show up and see the house without a prior appointment. So we showed up at the house, and we were greeted by a gentleman who was quite prominent in Oak Park. He was a real estate person. He was very active in his church, very highly thought of person, and he met us at the top of the stairs. And he said, "I'm sorry you can't see this house." And I said, "Well, why not? It's an open house. I mean, that means it's open, right, to everybody." And he said, no. He says, "You don't understand. It's not an M listing." And I said, "What do you mean it's not an M listing?" He said, "Well, an M listing is when somebody lists a house for sale and they tell us to put an M, and that means it can be shown to a minority family." And I said, "Oh my goodness." Well, by this time, the wife and the couple had walked up the stairs, and we kind of brushed past him. He was kind of at the top of the stairs, and we looked inside, and she looked inside at the hall, and it wasn't really the kind of house. They were looking for something a lot nicer, let's just say that. And she really, and she looked inside, and she said to the real estate person, "No, this really wouldn't do." She said, "It's just not what we have in mind. It isn't nice enough." And so we left that house, and subsequently, one of my neighbors, I lived on North Grove at that point, and one of my neighbors, very nice people, lovely people, called me and said, "We're going to be selling our house, and we know you're, involved with this open housing stuff, and maybe you have a black family that would be interested in seeing this house." And so they went to see it, they loved it, and they're still in it today. And so that was highly successful. But that was just one account, and there were many others I could tell you about. But if you haven't lived through it, it's hard to believe today in Oak Park that these things went on. And so I worked really hard with a lot of other people for passage of the Fair Housing Ordinance. I met Cherlynn like right after she moved in. I think we had hamburgers at my house, and we had a good time. She'd already gotten into her house. So it was a time of extreme activism. The passage of the Fair Housing Ordinance was very dramatic. Hazel Hanson, who's been mentioned here this evening, was quite a heroine. She was attacked by a lot of very hostile, racist people in the audience.
She had to have a police escort going home.
Right, and Hazel was on the village board. Hazel is the sister of Corelli Shoup. And when I went to Oak Park River Forest High School, I was in the same class with a very brilliant guy named Steph Shoup, and we're still friends to this day. He lives in Wisconsin. But he tells the story of Hazel and Corelli, two amazing women at a time when, two sisters who were so strong, so powerful. And Hazel was subjected to the most, it's hard to describe, threats, screaming that went on at the old Lowell School when we had hearings for the Fair Housing Ordinance. Now, I should say, for those of you who weren't there, that after the Fair Housing Ordinance was proposed, we worked on it like daily. We got out articles, we had speakers come in. It was a huge campaign to get the ordinance passed. And the Community Relations Commission, which Ginny was on, had to hear it first, and they passed on it first. And then it went to the Board of Trustees. And they spent a lot of time considering what would happen, and very courageously took a stand for passage of the Fair Housing Ordinance. There are people out there, Fran Sullivan, she and her husband Mo were very active in the Citizens Committee, and many other people who were active. It wasn't just a few people like me, Lee Brook, who's recently passed away. There's so many people who were courageous.
May I just say that one of those people was my good friend Paula Nelson.
Oh, Paula, my goodness.
I still remember
Yes.
going to a meeting at the high school, and Paula was on a platform getting ready to make her statement, and she was shouted down. I didn't know Paula at that time, but I happened to live across the street, and I, who didn't make cookies, made cookies and took them across the street to thank Paula for her grace under pressure. And we subsequently became very good friends.
If you haven't seen her nephew's film, which is very wonderful and was shown at the
It's an
library.
opera film.
Yes, about his grandfather, who was the composer who wrote this opera that he
wrote to
produced.
Andino.
Yeah, but anyway, so that's the connection with
Anyway,
Paula.
Rupert Wenzel was a dear friend of mine, and he was the man who was designated to move the passage of the ordinance. And he had prepared, Rupert told me, a short statement to make before moving the ordinance. And at Village Hall, he was shouted down.
Oh, yeah.
He could not make his statement, so he finally just said, I move the ordinance. And it was passed, I
The
think.
end of Bobby's story either, because Hazel Hanson was sitting on the stage. This woman, so irate, marched up onto the stage and throttled her, took hold of her neck.
Yeah.
At the high school? At the
Yeah,
high school. It was so violent, and people felt so strongly. To this day, people still do.
I think the ordinance passed with one negative vote, didn't it, Jenny?
And
I think there was one negative vote.
We had one realtor on that commission, and he did not have the enlightenment that the realty entities have now, that was the smartest thing that we did, to vote no for sale signs. Because the Austin community was just one sign after another. And panic peddling, they called it in those days, to frighten people into moving. So several of us here, including Cherlynn, really went through a very, very heavy-duty time in Oak Park. And I think those,
Bobbi gives the example of the one person, and we know she went through many more people. But I experienced it personally. It was my husband and I who went to the door after making all the arrangements to meet the people and look at their house to sell, to buy, and had them open the door, and when we told who we were, say, oh, that house isn't for sale. Our house isn't for sale anymore. What do you mean it isn't for sale anymore? Because by the time we were looking, the fair housing law had passed. So when they told me, or my husband and I, that it wasn't for sale anymore, it meant it wasn't for sale anymore for you. You know? And very many people just said that right out. We're not selling, and most of them said, we're not selling to niggers. It didn't matter whether you were colored or not, you were a nigger.
Did they really say that?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We had many people who said that. Bob James, God bless his soul, decided to take us on. And he was a realtor. And he said, you shouldn't go out by yourself. I'll go with you. Because anybody who says that is up for to be sued. And you know, you going by yourself may not be able to do that, but I can go with you, and if they say that with me with you, then I can pursue suit. And Jenny was at the Village Hall and at that time, and later I became there. But to have people just say to you, they don't even know who you are. They just see your face, and that's enough to say. And as a matter of fact, Henry and I were the first to buy through a local lending institution, which is no longer here. But they had an article in their newsletter about the first black family that they sold to. Of course, they had never turned, and they said this in the article, they'd never turned anybody else down. But we were the first one that they sold to because they had to. That's why. But to read that article and hear and see that they said, we never sold any black family down, but we are very glad that we sold a house to a black family, and it was ours. But Bob James Bob James took us to this house that we bought, that we're still in.
Well, he was the no vote at the time that we
Right.
tried, but that was understandable. There was one other vote along the way,
Brooks.
who said that they felt that we could actually do better than we were doing on some of the things we had included, and that we should be people of courage. And I thought of that this morning. I was looking in this New Time magazine, and one of the sponsor of this ad said, "Those who continually strive for something greater, the visionaries, the luminaries, the champions who push the boundaries and constantly set new standards for achievement. These lead by example. They inspire the world." I thought that was just right for what we were all doing. But there were other people
I
doing.
want to point out one thing, though, Jenny. A lot of people say when you pass a law, it doesn't automatically make a difference. I want to point out why it made a difference in Oak Park, because it did make a huge difference in Oak Park. And that was the enforcement of the law, and underline the word enforcement. Okay, what happened to me was one of the families I was working with tried to see a house, and they were turned away from the house. And I didn't go with them, but they let me know about it. And so I showed up at Village Hall, and John Dwyer and Ginny were there at Village Hall. And so John Dwyer said to me, there was an old manual typewriter sitting there, and he said, "Sit down and type out what happened, and give me the name of the family and, all the details," which I did. And John, that very moment after I completed it, picked up the phone, and he called the family that was selling the house. Do you remember this? Yeah. And he called him up, and he said, and he was very nice. He said, we passed this fair housing law a few days ago, and it really means a lot, blah, blah. And he went through the whole thing. And you really need to show the house to this family because, we have a law now, and you'll be going against the law, and we have to enforce it. And so they agreed to show the house, and thanks to John in pursuing that as he did. And so I think when people ask what made Oak Park different at that point, because there were many communities passing fair housing laws, but they did not have the enforcement, and they did not have the staff. And this was the old Village Hall over at Lake and Euclid, and it wasn't real fancy, and there wasn't a lot of staff. But the fact that John immediately pursued that, and John Dwyer still lives in Oak Park, and he's still looks pretty young, actually, considering how long ago that was. But I think, that to me stays in my mind, and so after that, we'll talk more about what happened after the law passed, but it did make a huge difference. Now, people ask about the population. There were 12 black families living in Oak Park in 1968, and that's the year that the ordinance passed. So consider that. That's a very small number. And some of those families were left over from the old days of the early 1900s, the Pyramids and other families who had been here straight through had lived in Oak Park. So, I think that it's important to know that when a law passes, and the League was very involved in this, and we need to get into that, but the League was very involved in
But there are two families that still live here, or at least part of one and the other one, and that's the Julians, Percy Julian, who moved in this community in 1951. He was a millionaire when he moved here, because he was a scientist and is still known for foam for putting out fires. He developed that. But they bought on what is known as scapegoat buyers. Someone else went in the house, a white family, went in the house, looked at the house, decided, went out and talked to the Julians about what the house looked at. It's at 515 Northeast Avenue. It's still there. The daughter still lives there. And the white family bought the house with the Julians' money, but gave their name. And a couple months after that, and the Julians moved in. And a couple months after that, the family went with the Julians to the bank and told them the house belonged to the Julians. And the Robinets, who live on the South Elmwood, 200 block at South Elmwood. As a matter of fact, my daughter works at Winberry's, and they come in once a month, the block. Some of them don't live on that block anymore, but the people who lived on that block when the Robinets moved in, and the Robinets had the same kind. Someone went in, white family, bought the house for them with their money, and then weeks later or months later, they went to the bank and told the bank that these people owned the house and showed proof of that. And those two families still live here. There's probably others who were here, like the Piermans, that they worked for the family that owned the house. And when the family died, they left the house, and that had been arranged to the Piermans, and that's how they moved in. So those things were going on. So there were so many people in the community who believed, that were white, who believed in the community, that's why, another reason why it went on.
Bobbi and I stood in the middle of Madison Street one day. We had Pierre DeVise, a sociologist, had said, well, you're just going to be, rolled over. They're going to be coming. And we knew what had happened in Austin. And she and I stood there, and we just held hands, and we said, looking east, we said, they are not going to do that here. And we worked so hard together, the two of us, for so many years on that. I want to just make a little liaison from this, because those of us that are here have this as a major emotional and intellectual part of our lives. But we benefited so from people who came and helped us think this thing through. So some people that had gone through really horror stories over in Austin said, let's think about it now before it's right there in our face. And we did that. And I think foresightedness is always of value. And it certainly was in Oak Park. And because I became the clerk in '73, and we had no solicitation laws and things to work with that the Austin community never had, to this day doesn't really have in the same manner. It was a very different climate. One of the things that I want to emphasize, that our police chief, who was Fremont Nestor, actually called people personally, went to visit them, said to an Italian couple, do you remember, he said, when I sat in your kitchen trying to give you solace because your neighborhood did not want an Italian person in this neighborhood. He said, this plays out over and over. If you have any doubts about it, be on the side of those who are following in your footsteps. And the other one was Harris Stevens, who was the manager of Oak Park. And he said, when people are irate with me about what's happening, I just say to them, well, if you're not happy, why don't you just move? There are a lot of people that would just love to move into your house. I mean, this was the attitude of
Well, I have to say, at that time when Pierre DeVise and Anthony Downs made their predictions, they were basing it on census data. A lot of people are very critical of, Pierre DeVise and Anthony Downs, but They were looking at the census data. They were looking at black by black racial change in Chicago neighborhoods, the Chicago pattern in quotes that you see in textbooks about racial change. I was working as a copywriter at that point in Chicago, and I've already talked about being active in the fair housing movement, and I decided to go back to school because it seemed like everybody who was involved was better educated than I was. So I thought, well, I'll go back to school, I'll get my master's degree in sociology, and then maybe I'll be equal to to these other people who have such good educations. And anyway, so I went back to school to Roosevelt, and I spent all of my time researching this issue and wrote my master's thesis, which was completed in '71. And I studied a few other communities in the United States, and I did a lot of research within Oak Park. And out of my master's thesis, which is now online at the library, so you don't even have to leave your house. You can just put in my name, you can just enter my name, and my master's thesis comes up, and you can easily read it without setting foot outside of your house. And it is fascinating. No, it isn't. It's not fascinating, and most of it's boring. But when I get to the end and I suggest what Oak Park could do to make things a little bit different and not really fall victim to all these bad practices that we had seen, I came up with the idea for a housing action center. And we went to the village, went to the Community Relations Commission, which was headed up by a guy named Dr. Wallace Kirkland, and who I subsequently married. But anyway, so we went there, and we said, we being about 20 people in Oak Park, we would like the Village of Oak Park to start this housing action center and work on housing demand and making sure that the village is properly promoted and marketed, and people really understand what we have to offer. And the Community Relations Commission sat and they said, well, that's a great idea. We don't think the village should do it. We don't think it should be an official program of the village. Why don't you go do it? So I wasn't really too interested in doing it at that point, but we got together in my living room on Grove with all these really nice people. Bill Killam, who was a minister at First Presbyterian Church, and Ed Adams, a family that had moved here from the South Side, many other people. And they said, Bobbi, you've done all this work, and you know about it, and you're speaking about it. Why don't you, we'll support you, but why don't you be the head of this? And I said, no, but I'm like teaching at Roosevelt, I'm really happy, and I don't think I really want to do that. And they said, yeah, you want to do it. And I agreed to 3 years. And it was 1971, and I agreed to 3 years. And I retired in 1997. So you can tell how that worked out. But the point is that, again, the village pulled together. And I think probably the village was right, the commission was right in saying they didn't want to do it, because then along came Chris Rano and Cherylyn Reid, and they headed up, the Community Relations Commission, and then Cherylyn on her own with Sandra and her staff. And that made a huge difference, because we worked so closely with the village government and with Cherylyn and
the president of the league.
Well, but I mean, in terms of the department of the village government, because Cherylyn was there.
And I think the first housing center.
After I left the office of league president in '73, I went out to the village hall one day and I looked around, and I went back a week later and I looked around, and finally I met with Chris, and I said, Chris, and of course, when you're president of the league, you know everybody in town. Yeah. Everybody knows you.
Chris Rano.
So Chris Rano, I went up to him and I said, Chris, we're talking about racial diversity and having a community that's racially diverse. And I'm here in Village Hall, and I don't see anybody in Village Hall that looks like me that works here. Mm-hmm. I said, so that means that we are limited in our racial diversity. Mm-hmm. It's okay to live here, but for heaven's sakes, you can't work here. And he said, well, you got a point. I said, let me sit down and tell you some things that I have in mind that we might do. And he said, "Are you willing to do it?" I said, "Yeah, in a week I'll be finished with the League of Women Voters. I'll be glad to come in." And so he said, "Well, I'll take you over to Lee, Lee Ellis, who was then the village manager. Chris was the director of the Community Relations Department." So we went over and talked about some of the things. I said, there are things that I can say to people that you can't say, either to a white person or to a black person. To a black person, it may not, you can live anywhere you want in this community, but we don't have to all live together.
Yeah.
We don't have to live on top of each other or next door to each other. You can live across town, and I can live across town. And to white people, I could say the same thing to them, only turn it around and say, you don't have to live with all white people. You can live where some black people live in the community and help the community. And wherever you move, we're going to eventually move there. So
I'm sorry, I'm going to change the topic just for a minute because Harriet hasn't had a chance to say anything yet. And Harriet has lots of stories, especially about her work with the ACLU and her fostering of children who came from Cuba when Castro came to power. So I would like to give Harriet a chance to
give her a chance.
The housing was very important because
It was.
I
So's your story.
I was a township trustee for 12 years, and working with the Housing Commission was very important because River Forest was, even though we were next door neighbors, they were a little reluctant to do the things that Oak Park was doing. So we fought pretty hard for this. So I feel very strongly with this. But
Somebody from River Forest said to me one day, if we can do it in River Forest as well as you did it in Oak Park, we will have very much succeeded. I can't think it was, and I thought, we all step on each other's shoulders.
absolutely,
know.
absolutely.
So you told me that you marched in Washington, D.C.
Oh my gosh, many times. We marched in Selma. We marched. My kids always complained. Other kids on vacations go places where they can swim and do things, and we march. But
Dr. King.
oh yes. That I didn't talk to him. He was with this group when we went to Selma, and he was so cordial to everyone around him. He was just one of us. We were just all together working for voting rights. And I think we're still doing that. And that was part of the ACLU, of what we decided. ACLU was the strongest organization to fight for voting rights. And we felt very strongly about it. And so that's how we got involved with ACLU. On the Cuban children, that was a very interesting adventure. The children, what happened was when Castro took over after Batista, many of the people who had children who were living there wanted to get them out of Cuba, and they usually were people with money, but we didn't know that. And we have a very nice house, but it's quite modest by comparison to these mansions that these kids came from in Cuba. We read in an article in the newspaper about these children that were brought in from Cuba, from other islands, from Jamaica, and they'd go through different areas because the United States wasn't really accepting them. But they got into the country from other places that the parents would get them to, and then they'd come in and they were placed in orphanages. They didn't know what to do with them. And so different organizations like the Lutheran Family Service, Catholic Family Service, the Jewish Family Service, and they were placing these children by their religion, which I thought was weird, but that was the case. In any event, we used to have a Sunday morning after Sunday school was a family meeting. We'd clean out the refrigerator, and that was our lunch, and we had 5 minutes for each of the children to say whatever they wanted without interruption. And it was always, she did this, he did that. But, you know, no interruptions, and things were cleared that way. And my husband said to the kids, how would you like it if we took in a foster child? And they thought, oh, Spanish, we could learn Spanish from them. It would be wonderful. We all felt like a bunch of martyrs. Oh, we'll take these poor children in, you know. We ended up applying, and we had to apply through the Jewish service, which was called HIAS, Jewish Hebrew Immigration Service. In any event, we applied, and they said, well, we have 2 children that are brother and sister, and we're really looking for some family who would be willing to take 2 children in. Well, okay, we can take 2 children. We have an extra bedroom, but unfortunately, one was a boy and one was a girl, and but we took them in. They were 11 and 9. My son was 14, my daughter 13, and she was 11. And in any event, we thought the 2 girls could stay together. There was terrible resentment when we came to the house, and I showed this girl whose name was Giselle. I said, Giselle, this is where you're going to be with Barbara. Not my room? She goes. And honestly, that was the way it was. She locked her out of the room every time she could. It was a disaster. I enrolled them into Willard School. My God, they were patient with me. They were wonderful because I did get a translator for them, but they did speak English. But of course, only speaking in English was still difficult to enter a school that only taught in English. So I had a translator for them, a young woman from Rosary College, and they started school, but they were so resentful of the fact that they had to walk the 2 blocks. They always, well, just imagine, the little boy was 9 years old. He had never tied his own shoes or buttoned his own shirt. That's how spoiled they were. They had servants for everything, chauffeur-driven cars. I mean, and then when I told them, everybody has to work in my house. We take turns, who takes off from the table, who sets the table. I was a Simon Legree. It was just dreadful for the first month, and I thought, this experiment is not going to work. But it was close to Christmas time then, and we were trying to figure out, what can we get them that would really please them, amuse them, make them feel that they're more in the family? Well, they'd never had bicycles. So my husband said, why don't we buy each of them a bicycle? Our kids have bicycles. They don't. This is something that they can have, that's theirs. Well, it was just like a miracle. First, my husband taught them how to ride we emptied the cars out of the garage, and they were going around in the garage learning to, and then when the weather cleared, they could take their bikes to school. It was just like an opening of a whole different childhood for them. And for us, it really was.
And you are still in touch with them, correct?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
Where are they now?
Well, it's very interesting because, especially with the boy, she was interesting as well. She was very talented. She knew many languages and then continued on that, became a translator for the UN. And but she had several husbands along the way. And right now she's single. No, that's not right. She's living away from her husband, but still married. She had 2 children, one living in Cuba, one living in Mexico now. And the boy, he wanted to be an architect more than anything in the world. So we paid for his schooling, even though the mother had come into the America, which is another story. I could be here all day.
Harriet, talk into your microphone.
Oh, he went to architecture school, graduated. He was thrilled with it. While at the University of Illinois, he met a young woman, and you guessed it, it was the right woman for him, and he got married. Her father was a diamond merchant, and we get this call, well, I'm not going to be in architecture anymore. I'm going to be a diamond merchant. And we've kept up with both of the children. And about, I'd say 15 to 20 years ago, he called me and said, you're not going to believe this, but I have talked it over with Mimi, who was his wife, and I've decided these years that I have worked for her father, I have made a lot of money, but my life is incomplete. And I've decided that at my age, I'm going to study for the rabbinate.
Oh, really?
We are not a religious family. I do belong to Oak Park Temple, and I'm very proud of it. But I can't say we've ever been devout in our religion. Perhaps we should have, but we weren't. And we were Reformed Jews. And then he's going to study to be a traditional Jew. In any event, the first thing that he did once he graduated was to officiate at his own son's bar mitzvah, which was a thrill. I attended it, but it was so strange because you have to sit upstairs when you're an Orthodox Jew. The women sit upstairs, the men downstairs. And they have little blinds. You're supposed to not be looking, you're supposed to hear. Well, I'm looking through the blind. I had to see everything that was going on. But it was really a shock. But he now is going from nursing home to nursing home, wherever they need a rabbi. He calls himself the traveling rabbi. And he is nursing it. He is taking care of different people at nursing homes where they have Jewish families.
I'm sorry to have to bring this to an end, but we are running a little late. We did want to leave some time for people to ask questions if they wish to. So.
How about if we give Barbara, though?
Well, Barbara has something in store for us yet.
All right. And before we leave this topic of interracial matters, if you do get the journal, our dear friend Ken Trainer wrote a wonderful article, and it will fill in all the things that we couldn't have time for tonight. So get yourself a copy. If you don't have one, take it out of your garbage cabinet and,
Or go to the journal and pick one up.
Yes.
It does mention a book about Oak Park, and 4 of these ladies are featured in the book.
And Bobbi wrote a book herself.
Yes. So, do we have any questions?
Which issue of the journal?
It's the May 16.
I just wanted to mention, because we didn't mention really what the Housing Center has done for the last 40-some years, but I think it's important to finish this off, really, by saying this experiment is not over yet. And so if I could have like 2 minutes or 3 minutes on that. People often say when they move into Oak Park, especially a lot of the young families that move in today, well, yeah, and it's a diverse place. And then I kind of watch my neighbors and people down the block, and all of their friends are white, all of their kids' friends are white, and I kind of look and say, well, where are we on this whole diversity issue? Also, they don't seem to understand what went on in the past and how you have to understand the past to understand the present and to think about the future of Oak Park. I think this is a miraculous place. I feel not only pride, but just great pleasure in seeing Oak Park every day and seeing how much more beautiful it is today than it was in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s.
Part of that, Bobbi.
Well, yeah,
and
but
there are people in our audience today who didn't
Don't know the story.
well, right. But I think that we should at least recognize the fact that it takes a continued effort to keep this community afloat, and the kinds of things that the Housing Center deals with. And I know the Housing Center is very open to people coming in and observing, and I often say, you need to spend a day at the Housing Center. And you see these white clients walk into the center looking for an apartment, and they say, well, I've heard Oak Park is just a great place to live. They're coming from Cleveland or someplace else, whatever. And then they say, well, but I've been told, I shouldn't really live east of Ridgeland, or I shouldn't really live east of Oak Park Avenue, or I should live here, or I shouldn't live there. And I've got this map, and I talked to the police department, and they all have these stories. And of course, the job of the Housing Center is to get people to consider the whole village, and particularly to continue getting white clients into diverse buildings in East Oak Park, to keep those buildings integrated. But it takes effort every single day, not just from the village, from the police department, from the fire department, from the Housing Center, from all of these bodies. And every time a policeman makes a comment like, oh, all the crime is over there, it's not safe here, or it's not safe there, every time that kind of comment is made, it affects the housing market. And so the reason I'm back active in the Oak Park Arts District on Harrison Street is because that has made just a huge difference in attracting all kinds of people to purchase and to rent housing in that neighborhood, because having the art galleries and the new restaurants and the new housing developments down there,
Maze Branch Library.
Yeah, we've transformed Harrison Street, and then they have the best library in Oak Park. I'm sorry to say that, but but it is. They're all wonderful, but the maze is very charming.
I worked for the village for 27 years after saying I'd only worked 4 when I started. But I used to say to people who said, well, they told me not to live east of this, and I'd say, well, we all live east of River Forest. So that's the way I'd stop them at that point, and then we could go on to where you want to live. But that was a statement that I just made to everybody.
I think Beverly had a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when the village was first integrated, were there problems in the school for the children as well?
Not as many, but there were some, because there were their parents.
Right.
Who caused a lot of them. And I can give you a personal example, is that my 3 daughters had their birthday parties the first years we lived here at home at lunchtime, because at that time everybody went home for lunch. So I would have their parties. One was in October and one was in February. And there were 2 girls in each one of their classes whose parents did not feel that being in a class with those folks was good. And so their children couldn't come to the birthday parties. Now, the invitation went to everybody in the class. Yeah. And I get this call, 2 calls one day, 2 different women saying to me, is it okay for my children to come to your daughter, whichever one it was, birthday party? And I said, are you in their class? Are your children in their class? And they said yes. And I said, yeah. And I said, as a matter of fact, because I got the tenor that was going on, and I knew who the kids were, because they had already been told that they weren't allowed to play with them. So I already knew. And I said, as a matter of fact, you can come too. I said, because you only got an hour, so 45 minutes. So I said, you can come too. What I realized as time went on is that they realized that that day, whatever day it was, their kids were not going to be where all the class was, all the rest of the class. So that was a situation where the parents had said, you can't come, you can't play with those kids. So of course you can't go to their birthday party. But once they realized that, they decided to call. And there was one day where I realized that my one daughter was being called a nitty or nigger or something. And so I went to school and I said to the principal, I'm going down to this class because I understand that there's a substitute teacher in there. And I told him what was going on. I said, you can come with me. I said, there won't be any violence because I don't believe in violence. So I said, but I am going to talk to the class. And so he said, go ahead. He didn't want to go. It's interesting. His name was Reed, but it was R-E-E-D. But anyway, I went down to the class, and I said to the class, everybody know who I am? and everybody said, you're Mrs. Reed, you're Dorothy's mother. Didn't mean to give her name, but anyway, I said, okay, good. I'm glad you know Dorothy's name. I said, because I understand, and I knew who the kids were, that some of you have been calling her a pickaninny and a nigger and a few other things. And I said, I want you to know her name is Dorothy. And you call her that, or you go to jail. Scared kids to death. and I said, because you don't want to be called out of your name, and she didn't want to be called out of hers. And then that night, my husband called all the fathers of those kids and said that their kids had been molesting his daughter. Now, I know all of you know what molesting means. You don't want to hear that your kids have been molesting anybody. But he knew the term to use that would shake them up. And one father admitted that he did tell his kids what our kids were in terms of pickaninny or nigger. And he won't do that anymore, he said. He said to me, I won't do that anymore. He said, okay, because I will call the police and have you arrested for your kids molesting my kids. But there wasn't a lot of that. I mean, I got, parents are quick to recognize that in that kind of setting, you need to do the right thing. And they did the right thing.
Well, I was going to say in answer to your question also that, and this is quite lengthy, and the league was involved with this, was the school reorganization plan. And that was mostly men and women from the community served on a committee to look at each of the schools' racial diversity and how the whole community could be more equitably divided in terms of diversity. And so that would be something you can Google the school reorganization plan, District 97, but that's what resulted in the 2 middle schools and the 8 grade schools. And I think that it's probably time to take another look at it, because when that was passed, and maybe this is something the league should look into as well, but when that was passed, the statement was made, this is something we will revisit this. We will revisit the school reorganization plan, and it needs to be looked at again, I think, and just see how are we doing, what else could we do, and how could other changes be made, because there's been a lot of changes since that happened, the reorganization plan.
I think we're going to have to wrap this up, but before we do, we have a treat in store for us. Barbara has not mentioned the fact that she has, for the last 6 years, been one of the people organizing poetry readings. And each year they choose a theme that they are going to use. And I think it was last year you said it was women. And so she has agreed to read for us a poem about women.
Well, Mary, this isn't exactly a poem about women.
Barbara has chosen to read a poem about something other than women.
This was our 6th year. Our first year was Poems from 100 Years of Poetry magazine. It was founded by Harriet Monroe in Chicago in 1913. There was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And I still remember when our poetry planning group sat around a table, I said, I'm going to read Trees by Joyce Kilmer. And Mary Schmutenmeyer, who was one of our group, I still remember this, said, Barbara, you're not going to read that sentimental claptrap. I said, yes, Mary, I am. That's the most famous poem that was ever written that was published in Poetry magazine. So anyway, our group has had poetry programs for 6 years. And this year, our theme was poems about water. And I happened to collect a poet called Jared Manley Hopkins, and he has a beautiful poem called Inversnade about a mountain creek in Scotland, this darksome burn, horseback brown, its roll rock high road roaring down, etc. But I decided not to read that. I'm reading Phyllis McGinley, who wrote this poem in the 1940s. It's called Small Town Parade, and I thought it would be appropriate since Memorial Day is Monday. And this is Small Town Parade Decoration Day. Below the lawns and picket fences just past the firehouse half a block, sharp at 11:05 commences this ardent and memorial walk, announced last night for 10 o'clock. Solemn beneath the elmy arches, neighbor and next-door neighbor meet, for half the village forward marches to the school band's uncertain beat, and half is lined along the street. Oh, the brave show. Oh, the twirling baton. Oh, drummer stepping smartly out. Oh, mare perspiring with no hat on. Oh, nurse's aide. Oh, martial rout of bluebird, brownie, eagle scout. And at the rear, aloof and splendid, lugging the lanterns of their pride, oh, the red firemen, well attended by boys on bicycles who ride with envious reverence at their side. The morning smells of buds and grasses. Birds twitter louder than the flute, and wives, as the procession passes, wave plodding husbands' wild salute from porches handy to the root. Flags snap, and children, vaguely greeted, wander into the ranks a while. The band, bemused but undefeated, plays Sousa pedagogic style, clean to the square, a measured mile. Until at last, by streets grown stony, to the gray monument they bring the wreath, which is less testimony to death than life, continuing through this and every other spring.
Oh, that's beautiful. Lovely.
We owe these ladies so much, not just for tonight, but for what they have done with their lives. So I'd ask you to stand and take their group.
I was going to say, you only heard the tip of the iceberg tonight, because we were, all of us, the kind of women that have done everything else that there was to be done, it seems like, and done it well. So I feel that we've talked a lot about the racial diversity, and we've talked about things that, you know, the poetry piece of Barbara's wonderful life. And I just wanted to say, all of you that have worked with us, and a lot of you have made us what we are. And we are so grateful for your
So we're going to give you a clap.
Yeah.
Before we depart, I got just one quick announcement. I want to point out the symbolism of the vases. There are 5 roses, 5 yellow roses. Well, I should ask you, what's the symbol of the yellow rose? Very good. If you were pro-19th Amendment, you wore a yellow rose. Yellow was our color. And I happen to have a few extra roses, and it occurred to me that while we're honoring our 50-year members today, I would like, this just came to me, I would like anyone who is a new member to just raise your hand, because I have a few roses. I think I would have at least one for each new member, 2017 or 2018. So and give your name so people know you're a new member and have an opportunity to introduce themselves and come get your rose. You first, Carrie?